I remember that evening so clearly, even now, as if every detail was etched into my memory with sharper edges than reality deserved. We were sitting around the dinner table, laughter bouncing off the walls like it always did when my parents and siblings gathered. Yet something felt off before a single word was spoken. I had spent the entire afternoon trying to act normal, pretending the weight of the $200K I'd been entrusted with didn't occupy a corner of my mind that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't money I had earned. It was money given to me to manage, a responsibility I hadn't fully embraced until that exact moment. Then he asked it. Out of nowhere, like a knife sliding quietly between ribs, my brother's voice cut through the chatter. "So, what did you do with it?" He said it casually, too casually, like he was asking about the leftover pasta in the fridge, rather than hundreds of thousands of dollars. But his eyes betrayed him. They weren't curious. They were calculating. There was a flicker of something darker beneath the surface, something that made my stomach churn. I froze. $200K. I said the number in my head over and over, each repetition louder than the last, each time making it feel heavier. I had walked past it 1,000 times in my mind, planning, calculating, pretending I understood the implications of having that much power under my control. But hearing it spoken aloud made it tangible, terrifying, and strangely intimate. The weight of it pressed down on me, not just financially, but emotionally, because it wasn't just money. It was trust. It was expectation. It was a reflection of every family dynamic that had shaped me. I looked at him, trying to read the real meaning behind the casual tone, and suddenly all the little things I'd ignored before made sense. The small digs about my career, the passing comments about my lack of ambition, the subtle comparisons to him, always shining brighter in our parents' eyes. The question wasn't about curiosity, it was about testing me. He wanted to see if I was faltering, if I was weak, if I had mishandled something he believed should have been his. My parents didn't notice immediately, or perhaps they were pretending not to. That was our family's way, the way it always had been. Ignore the tension, hope it disappears, and pretend that appearances mattered more than truth. But I noticed. I always noticed, and tonight I could feel it in my chest. A tightening knot that warned me this wasn't a casual question. This was the first crack in the facade we had all built. The first sign that the polished surface of our family's everything is perfect veneer was starting to crumble. I swallowed hard, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't give away too much, yet also wouldn't betray my own shock. I wanted to ask him why he was suddenly concerned, why he was pretending it was casual, but something in me held back. There was a history between us, unspoken but heavy. Rivalry, jealousy, and the subtle ways he had always tried to undermine me while I smiled and endured. I could see it now, clearer than ever in the way he shifted slightly in his chair, the faint twitch of his jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. That small moment told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't asking about the $200K to be informed. He was gauging, probing, seeing if he could find weakness, and perhaps if the opportunity presented itself, exploit it. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, feeling the tension thrum in the air like electricity before a storm. It was terrifying and intoxicating at the same time. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about power. It was about control. And for the first time in years, I felt like I might finally understand how to wield it, and perhaps how to turn it against those who had underestimated me. The question hung there, sharp and precise, demanding a response, and I knew that the evening had just changed. Nothing would ever feel the same at that table again. After dinner, I retreated to my room, the air heavy with the tension my brother's question had unleashed. My hands trembled slightly as I opened my laptop and accessed the financial records I had kept meticulously. At first I couldn't focus. The numbers on the screen swam before my eyes, but as I scrolled through the statements and spreadsheets, clarity struck, and it was like a punch to the gut. The $200K I had been entrusted to manage had not been used as agreed. Not even close. Panic clawed at my chest. Disbelief turned my stomach, and anger bubbled beneath the surface like a pot left unattended. I clicked through each entry repeatedly, as if seeing it over and over might somehow rewrite history. But the numbers didn't lie. My brother had redirected some of the funds, left certain investments neglected, and worst of all, made decisions that benefited him at my, and by extension, my family's expense. Every misused dollar was a betrayal, not just financially but emotionally. How could someone so close, someone I had shared so many years with, disregard trust so completely? I felt my hands tighten into fists, and for a moment, I wondered if I should confront him immediately. Flashbacks surged unbidden, memories of my childhood and adolescence washing over me with a clarity that cut deeper than any spreadsheet. I remembered my birthday parties, always smaller, quieter, and less attended than my brother's elaborate celebrations. I remembered being passed over for recognition in school and at family gatherings while he basked in praise and attention. Even as children, there had been this imbalance, an unspoken favoritism that had shaped my sense of self and my family's expectations of me. I had tried to ignore it, rationalize it, and forgive it, but now, looking at the evidence in black and white, the emotional weight hit me like a tidal wave. I thought of all the times he had subtly undermined me, the way he would comment on my career choices as if they were inferior, the way he casually mentioned achievements that he claimed I could never match, the sly satisfaction he seemed to derive from my discomfort. It was one thing to endure that as a sibling rivalry, but to see it bleed into something so tangible, so financially damaging, made the betrayal undeniable. Every dollar misused felt like a tiny echo of every slight, every snub, every whispered comparison I had endured my entire life. My internal monologue turned over my options like stones, weighing the consequences of each. Should I confront him immediately, right here, right now, while the anger still burned bright and sharp? Or should I wait, watch, and plan, ensuring that when the time came, my response would hit with precision and undeniable impact? The thought of a measured approach appealed to a part of me I rarely acknowledged. My desire for control, for strategy, for justice that was deliberate rather than impulsive. But another part of me, raw and furious, wanted nothing more than to lash out, to make him feel the immediate weight of my realization. The room felt smaller as I sat there, eyes scanning numbers, memories, and possibilities, each one layering onto the other until I could barely breathe. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It had shape, form, and stakes. It wasn't just about money. It was about everything he represented in my life. The favoritism, the manipulation, the smug assumption that he was always one step ahead, and yet, beneath the panic and anger, there was something else. A spark of clarity, the realization that now, finally, I had all the information I needed. I understood the magnitude of his deception, and I could feel the gears of my mind beginning to turn, plotting how to reclaim what was mine. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but the first step had been taken. I knew what had been done, I knew who had done it, and I knew that the next move had to be mine. The next family dinner felt different from the moment I stepped into the room. The air carried a subtle tension that I couldn't ignore, like a thin sheet of ice stretching across the table, ready to crack. My parents chatted politely, oblivious, or pretending to be, while my brother sat across from me, his smile a fraction too tight, his hands fidgeting with his napkin. I could feel it in every line of his body, the envy, the fear, the awareness that the balance of power might be shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. As the conversation began, small jabs started flying, each seemingly casual, each loaded with meaning. My brother asked about my work in a tone meant to belittle, the kind of question designed to highlight inadequacy. "So, how's that little project of yours coming along? Making any real progress this time?" I forced a polite laugh, but inside my chest tightened. I could sense the deliberate undercurrent, the silent challenge, the subtle attempt to assert dominance. I watched my parents' faces, noting how they half smiled, half shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They noticed the tension, I realized. Everyone did. Even the younger cousins exchanged glances, sensing something unspoken between us. That awareness made the moment sharper, more humiliating in its public subtlety. It wasn't overt confrontation yet, but the audience, the family, was now fully aware that a storm was brewing, and they were witnessing the first sparks. My brother continued, trying to downplay the situation, to mask his concern with casual arrogance. He made small jokes about money management, careful not to accuse me outright, but loaded enough to make me react. "I guess you've been keeping busy with the funds," he said lightly, raising an eyebrow. His tone was feigned calm, but I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of panic that I had sensed the night before. He was rattled, and it thrilled me in a way I couldn't admit. The humiliation wasn't mine alone. It was collective. The subtle power struggle played out under the gaze of everyone at the table. Each joke, each glance, each forced smile built the tension further. I realized that this was not just about the money anymore. It was about pride, about reputation, about control. And I could see it reflected in my family's eyes. The curiosity, the apprehension, the unspoken question of who would emerge victorious. I remained outwardly composed, but inside, I was calculating. Every word, every glance, every slight pause became data points I could use. I noted how he flinched when my eyes lingered on him, how he shifted nervously when certain topics came up, how the smallest insinuation from me could destabilize him completely. It was intoxicating, seeing the carefully constructed image of superiority start to crumble in real time. By the end of dinner, the stage was set. The subtle humiliation had done its work, laying bare the cracks in our family dynamics. I knew the confrontation was coming, and I could almost feel the electricity of anticipation that would follow it. My brother might not have realized it yet, but I had begun to shift the balance. The audience of my family, and anyone witnessing this from the outside, was now fully engaged, waiting for the next move, aware that the quiet power struggle at this dinner table was only just beginning. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that dinner, about the way my brother had phrased his question, about the flicker of panic I had seen in his eyes. Something felt deliberate, like a thread I hadn't yet pulled. I began observing him more closely, noticing the subtle ways he moved, the guarded tone in his conversations, the way he tried to charm our parents whenever I entered a room. Every interaction now seemed layered with intention, as if he were testing boundaries, probing to see what he could get away with. I started revisiting private conversations we had over the years, the casual mentions of money, investments, and inheritance. His tone always carried a faint edge, a suggestion that he was somehow entitled, that he deserved more than anyone else. I remembered a time when I had been promoted at work and he brushed it off, saying I'd never be able to manage a real responsibility. And yet, when an opportunity for wealth presented itself, suddenly, he acted as if he had the right to it. The inconsistency gnawed at me. Flashbacks emerged unbidden, sharp and painful. I recalled birthdays where he received extravagant gifts, while I got the bare minimum. Holidays where he was praised endlessly for his accomplishments, while mine were minimized, almost ignored. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a pattern, a carefully maintained hierarchy where he thrived at my expense. And now, looking back, I could see the lines connecting those moments to his current behavior, the subtle groundwork laid for him to claim the $200K as if it were owed to him. I began piecing together the hints he had left, the little comments about investment opportunities that somehow always seemed to favor him, the offhand remarks about trust and responsibility that carried an undercurrent of accusation toward me. I realized he had been testing the waters for years, measuring how far he could push, preparing for this exact moment. The thought made my chest tighten. The betrayal wasn't a sudden lapse. It was methodical. The more I observed, the more I understood his mindset. He saw himself as the rightful heir, the one deserving of the rewards, while I was just the placeholder, someone he could manipulate or outmaneuver. The weight of it hit me harder than I expected. The money itself mattered, yes, but what stung more was the audacity, the assumption that he could just take what he wanted, simply because he had always been allowed to dominate our family dynamic in subtle ways. I started questioning every interaction I'd had with him over the years. Every time he smiled a little too broadly when our parents praised him, every time he minimized my achievements, every casual comment about my supposed lack of business acumen, they were all part of a larger pattern. I realized I had underestimated him, blinded by the assumption that family meant honesty, loyalty, and fairness. Those expectations were naive, anger mixed with a strange clarity. I knew now that if I wanted to reclaim control, I couldn't act impulsively. I had to understand him fully, anticipate his moves, and plan carefully. The betrayal was deep, but knowledge was now my advantage. I could trace the path he intended to take, predict his next steps, and prepare for the moment when I would turn the tables. Sitting alone, replaying these revelations in my mind, I felt the first spark of determination. This wasn't just about the 200K anymore. It was about proving to him, and to the rest of the family, that I was not weak, that I would not be sidelined, and that every ounce of favoritism he had ever enjoyed could be challenged. For the first time, I felt like the pieces were falling into place. The hidden motive was no longer hidden, and understanding it gave me the power I had lacked for so long. I closed the door behind me and let the silence envelop the room, the world outside fading into the background. Sitting at my desk, I stared at the numbers, the spreadsheets, and the mental map of every family interaction I could remember. My mind felt electric, buzzing with a mix of anger, clarity, and a strange exhilaration. For the first time in years, I realized I wasn't just reacting. I could plan, strategize, and reclaim control. They didn't know who they were messing with. I began by retracing every move my brother had made regarding the 200K, noting inconsistencies, careless decisions, and moments where he had underestimated me. Every oversight he'd made became an opportunity. Every smug comment a clue. I realized that patience was my ally. Rushing into confrontation would only expose my vulnerabilities. I needed to build a plan that was methodical, precise, and psychologically powerful. As I laid out my strategy, I considered multiple angles. First, I had to ensure that any claim I made could not be disputed. Documentation, records, even casual email exchanges could become tools to prove both ownership and negligence. Then I considered timing. Public confrontation might carry the most impact, but private preparation was crucial to avoid mistakes. Each decision I made in this mental blueprint felt like placing chess pieces on a board, anticipating his every move. FOMO began to creep in as I imagined the upcoming moments. My family had no idea how carefully I was calculating my next steps, how quietly I had observed their behavior, how deeply I understood the power dynamics that had governed our lives for decades. They thought they were safe, that the status quo would persist, but I was about to rewrite it. I let myself smile, a small private thrill at the thought of the reversals to come. I revisited past incidents in my mind, moments where my brother's arrogance had cost him subtly, even if no one else noticed. There had been opportunities he had overlooked, which I could exploit. I visualized how I would use his own patterns of behavior against him, his tendency to overestimate his control, his need for approval from our parents, and his assumption that I lacked ambition or cunning. Each flaw became a tool, each misstep a step closer to leveling the field and taking back what had been mismanaged. I also rehearsed the emotional component of my strategy. I needed to remain calm, composed, and seemingly unaffected, letting him feel the tension and fear build without giving him a single clue about the depth of my awareness. His eyes would betray him first, then his tone, and eventually his pride would crumble. I savored the anticipation quietly, understanding that every detail mattered: timing, words, body language, and the reactions of those around us. The plan wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming respect, proving competence, and establishing boundaries that had long been ignored. I wanted him to understand that underestimating me had been his biggest mistake, and that every slight, every casual assumption would have consequences. My calculations weren't cold. They were fueled by a mix of anger, patience, and the desire for poetic justice that felt both personal and necessary. As I mapped the next few weeks in my mind, I felt a sense of control I hadn't experienced before. I was no longer a passive observer of my family's favoritism and manipulations. I was the strategist, the quiet force ready to shift the balance. The thrill of possibility coursed through me. They didn't know what was coming, and that ignorance would work in my favor. The stage was being set, and when the time came, every move would be deliberate, precise, and unforgettable. I decided to test the waters, to see how far I could push without fully revealing my hand. It started with subtle remarks, casual questions laced with implications, as though I was speaking without speaking. At first, my brother didn't react, or pretended not to, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten, the slight narrowing of his eyes whenever I mentioned investments or financial plans. Every flicker of discomfort told me more than words ever could. During one lunch with just the immediate family, I casually brought up the topic of long-term financial responsibility, framing it as if I were merely philosophizing. "It's interesting how some people think they can manage money without really thinking through consequences," I said lightly, stirring my coffee. My brother's hand froze mid-motion, the fork hovering awkwardly in the air. I caught the flicker of panic in his eyes before he forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. The more I probed, the more cracks appeared. I mentioned accounts, investments, and hypothetical situations, always with a casual, almost offhand tone, but each phrase carried a subtle weight. "I've been reviewing some numbers lately. Sometimes I can't believe what people assume they're entitled to," I said during one conversation, letting my words hang in the air. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at our parents for reassurance, as if seeking validation for a lie he hoped would go unnoticed. Internally, I was a storm of calculation. Each reaction was data, every twitch of unease a confirmation that he feared exposure. I replayed past interactions in my mind, realizing how often he had relied on my willingness to avoid conflict, how often he assumed I wouldn't notice. Now the power dynamics were beginning to flip, and I could feel it in every subtle shift at the table, in every glance he cast my way. During a casual chat later, I mentioned, almost jokingly, that certain funds were being carefully monitored. "I always double-check things," I said lightly, as if that explained everything. He stiffened, and I saw the tension radiating through him. His smile faltered, and I could almost hear the mental gears turning behind his eyes, calculating how he might respond without revealing his missteps. I smiled inwardly, savoring the psychological leverage I was slowly gathering. I allowed myself small internal monologues, reflecting on the years of favoritism and subtle undermining. Each flashback made his discomfort sweeter, each memory reinforcing the stakes of the current interaction. I remembered how he had laughed at my early career choices, mocked my careful attention to detail, and assumed I lacked ambition. And now, watching him squirm under my subtle prodding, I realized the irony. The very traits he had belittled in me were becoming weapons in my hands. The tension escalated further during a family gathering. I dropped another hint about the $200K, phrased in a way that implied I had complete knowledge, yet offered no explicit accusations. His eyes widened slightly and he shifted in his seat, glancing at the adults as if to gauge whether they noticed anything. I noticed. Every minute twitch, every swallowed word, every awkward smile was a signal, and I cataloged them meticulously in my mind. By the end of the day, the psychological struggle was palpable. He was visibly uncomfortable, aware that his behavior had been detected but unsure of how much I truly knew. I, on the other hand, was calm, observing, calculating, letting the tension simmer. I had begun to test the boundaries, and each reaction confirmed one truth. The power was slowly, unmistakably shifting in my favor. The next moves would be crucial, but now I had him exactly where I wanted. Precarious, exposed, and scrambling under the weight of his own miscalculations. The moment came sooner than I expected. It was another family gathering, an anniversary dinner for our parents, full of laughter, polite conversations, and that invisible undercurrent of tension that always hummed when we were in the same room. My brother arrived, confident as ever, greeting everyone with the charm he had perfected over the years. But I could sense the flicker of unease behind his smile. He had been waiting for me to slip, to lose the quiet composure I'd maintained. He didn't know that tonight, the dynamic would shift entirely. I had spent days preparing, gathering the necessary documents, bank statements, signed agreements, and a few digital correspondences that made everything irrefutable. I wasn't going to expose him recklessly, but I wanted him to know that I held all the cards now. The timing had to be perfect, public enough to sting, controlled enough to preserve my dignity. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Conversations flowed around work, travel, and family memories. My brother dominated, as usual, talking loudly about a supposed investment opportunity he was overseeing. I listened quietly, my fingers lightly tapping the folder in my lap. His arrogance was almost comical now, considering how easily his facade could crumble with a few well-placed words. "So," I said finally, interrupting him mid-sentence with a calm smile. "Speaking of investments, it's interesting how transparency can really strengthen trust in family matters. Don't you agree?" He froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a laugh. "Of course. Communication's key, right?" I nodded slowly. "Exactly. That's why I made sure to have everything documented. The transfer details, agreements, dates. You know, just to keep things clear for everyone." The table fell quiet, forks pausing midair. My mother looked up from her plate, confused but attentive. My father's brow furrowed slightly, sensing the shift in tone. My brother's expression faltered, the usual ease in his posture replaced by a barely concealed stiffness. "Oh, what documentation are you talking about?" he asked, his voice wavering just enough for me to notice. I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "Oh, nothing complicated. Just the official records for that $200K fund I was managing. You remember? The one with both our names attached?" A visible ripple went through the room. My parents exchanged uncertain glances. My brother's knuckles whitened around his glass. "Right," he said tightly, trying to recover. We don't really need to get into details here, do we?" "Of course not," I said smoothly, still smiling. "But I just wanted to reassure everyone that everything's properly handled. There's nothing unclear, nothing missing. Everything's accounted for, with proof." The silence that followed was delicious. The air was thick with unspoken awareness, and for the first time, my brother was the one shrinking under the collective gaze. His usual confidence cracked around the edges, the glib ease evaporating as he searched for words that wouldn't trap him further. I caught his eye and saw the flicker of fear, the realization that I wasn't bluffing, that I held evidence, control, and composure all at once. Internally, a rush of vindication coursed through me. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, steady, and deeply satisfying. This was the first reversal, the moment the audience had been waiting for. The years of being dismissed, the subtle humiliation, the favoritism, it all balanced out in that instant. He was caught in his own web, and all I had to do was hold my silence a little longer. My father cleared his throat, sensing the discomfort. "Well," he said cautiously, "it's good to hear everything's transparent." "Yes," I replied evenly, eyes still on my brother. "Transparency is everything." He couldn't meet my gaze after that. His laughter, when it returned, was hollow and strained. The room eventually moved on, but the power dynamic had changed permanently. For the first time, he knew I wasn't the same person he could manipulate or outshine. I had shifted the ground beneath him, and he was just beginning to feel it crumble. The days that followed the first dinner revelation were electric with tension. Every family interaction felt like walking through a minefield. One wrong word, one slip, and the quiet storm I had begun could explode. My brother's behavior became more erratic. Subtle stares, forced laughter, and fleeting attempts at dominance that were quickly undercut by the knowledge that I was watching, calculating and fully aware of his missteps. He had been unmasked, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of the family began to notice. I started to notice the subtle shifts in family dynamics. My parents, who had always maintained a delicate neutrality, were now visibly uncomfortable. Their glances lingered longer at me than before. Questions came in hushed tones, and they paused at my words more carefully. Cousins and siblings whispered under their breaths, exchanging glances when I entered the room, as if the tension was contagious. I could feel the energy thickening, the sense of anticipation building in every corner of the room. Everyone was aware that something had shifted, even if they couldn't yet articulate it. I began to play into the outrage, letting subtle remarks and questions drip like slow poison into conversations. "It's funny," I said lightly one evening, "how some people assume things will always go unnoticed. But transparency has a way of surfacing eventually, doesn't it?" The words were casual, almost innocent, yet I could see the effect on my brother immediately. His fork hovered midair, his lips pressed into a tight line, and his usual bravado faltered for just a moment. Contrast framed the situation perfectly. Where he was rigid, panicked, and faltering, I remained calm, composed, and deliberate. The imbalance was clear not just to him, but to the surrounding family. Every sigh he attempted, every forced chuckle, and every awkward glance made his vulnerability more visible. And in that visibility, I found a quiet satisfaction. For the first time, the narrative that had always favored him, confidence, charm, assumed dominance, was now flipped, leaving him exposed. Family members began taking sides, quietly aligning themselves without openly acknowledging the tension. Whispers carried judgments, shared assumptions, and subtle critiques. "I wonder if he really thought no one would notice," one cousin muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. "It's about time someone stood up to him," my aunt added under her breath. Each whisper fed the fire, each reaction reinforcing my advantage. My brother could feel it too, and I saw the panic in his eyes deepen. I allowed the psychological pressure to build slowly, carefully. I didn't need to raise my voice or issue direct confrontations. My silence, my subtle hints, and the confident way I engaged with others were enough to let him feel the growing isolation. He had underestimated me, assuming I would remain passive and compliant. That assumption had been his mistake, and now it was a weapon in my hands. The crescendo of tension peaked when he tried to make a casual joke about financial responsibility, an attempt to reassert his control. I responded with a neutral smile, letting the weight of the earlier revelation hang in the air. His words faltered mid-sentence, his eyes darting around the table, searching for allies. But everyone had noticed the cracks, and the whispers around the room amplified the sense of exposure. He was trapped in a social spotlight he hadn't prepared for. By the end of the evening, the emotional landscape had shifted decisively. I remained composed, my voice calm, my demeanor steady, while he struggled to regain any semblance of authority or confidence. The contrast was stark, almost cinematic. The panicked, shrinking figure across from me and the quiet, unshakable presence I projected. The stage was set for the next phase, where subtle manipulation would evolve into decisive action, and the first public hints of true reversal would soon take place. I had been reviewing files late one night, alone in the quiet of my apartment, when I stumbled across something that made my heart pound and my breath catch. At first I thought I had misread it. Maybe it was a clerical error, a coincidence. But as I examined the documents more closely, the truth became undeniable. My brother had been secretly attempting to access additional funds, manipulating legal paperwork, and subtly shifting assets in ways he assumed no one would notice. My hands shook slightly as the realization hit me. He hadn't just mismanaged the $200K. He had actively tried to take more, scheming behind the scenes, and assuming I would remain oblivious. The revelation made every prior interaction suddenly sharper, more sinister. The casual questions at dinner, the forced laughter, the subtle jabs, they weren't mere arrogance or oversight. They were part of a larger plan, one I hadn't fully anticipated but now had all the evidence to dismantle. Every flashback to years of favoritism, manipulation, and covert undermining now carried even more weight. This wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was deliberate, premeditated deceit. And I finally had the proof. I leaned back in my chair, letting the document settle in front of me. I could see the pattern of his manipulation clearly. Attempts to redirect funds, forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, and correspondence that suggested he had been consulting with legal advisors behind my back. He had underestimated me completely, assuming that my focus on fairness, patience, and careful observation meant I would never uncover his machinations. The audacity made my blood boil, but beneath that anger, a surge of exhilaration rose, because I now held the upper hand entirely. The psychological impact was immediate. In my mind, I could picture the power reversal in slow motion, his confidence faltering as the truth emerged, the whispers of family members as they realized he had been attempting deception, the way he would struggle to explain himself when confronted. I could almost feel the FOMO rippling through him, how it must have felt to realize that he was no longer in control, that I had seen every move, and that his assumed dominance had evaporated overnight. I thought back to the subtle moments I had noticed over the previous weeks, his flinches when I mentioned accounts, the nervous glances at our parents, the shallow jokes that didn't land. Each of these micro-moments now had context, and I could see clearly how he had miscalculated entirely. He had assumed ignorance, underestimating my attention to detail and my capacity for strategic thinking. Every assumption he had made about me, every time he assumed I wouldn't notice or wouldn't act, had now become ammunition. I spent hours organizing the information, cross-referencing statements, dates, and email exchanges. By the time I finished, I had created a complete, airtight record of his attempted manipulation. It wasn't just about proving he was wrong. It was about controlling the narrative entirely. The upper hand was mine, and for the first time, I felt unshakably in command of the situation. My brother, who had once cast long shadows over every family decision, was suddenly vulnerable, exposed, and scrambling to maintain his facade. Even as I cataloged the documents, a sense of calm replaced the initial surge of anger. This wasn't impulsive revenge. It was strategy, patience, and precision. I could feel the thrill of the impending confrontation, the satisfaction of knowing that when the moment came, the revelation would strike with maximum impact. The twist discovery had changed everything. It was the pivot point, the turning of the tide, and the audience of family and onlookers would witness the full weight of his miscalculations. I leaned back once more, taking a deep breath, savoring the quiet before the storm. This wasn't just a revelation. It was a weapon. And when I wielded it, there would be no question who held the power, who had been underestimated, and who was about to rewrite the rules entirely. The stage was set, and the next act promised chaos, confrontation, and undeniable triumph. The family had gathered for another celebration, a milestone birthday for my parents, and I could feel the energy in the room as soon as I walked in. Everyone was chatting, glasses clinking, laughter floating in the air, but beneath it all, tension hummed like a live wire. My brother greeted me with a confident smile, the same one he had perfected over the years, assuming that I was still the passive sibling he could dismiss or manipulate. He didn't know that today. Everything would change. As the evening progressed, I waited patiently for the right moment, letting conversations flow naturally while I observed him. I noticed how he kept stealing glances at me, like a predator sensing that its prey had finally grown claws. I could feel the anticipation building, both in myself and in the subtle shifts of the room. Family members were starting to sense the undercurrent, whispers circulating, glances exchanged. Everyone felt it, even if they couldn't yet see it fully. Finally, I spoke. "I've been reviewing some of the financial records," I said calmly, letting my words carry the weight of certainty. The room quieted instantly. My brother's smile faltered, his posture stiffened, and he tried to mask the sudden panic. I continued, pacing my words with deliberate precision. "I noticed some irregularities, funds that were moved without authorization, transfers that weren't recorded correctly, and decisions made that shouldn't have been made at all." His eyes widened slightly, and I could see the moment his confidence cracked. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, trying to regain control, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The proof was undeniable. The documents I had prepared were bulletproof, and I could see in his face the realization that he had been caught. I slowly reached into my bag and laid out the records on the table, letting everyone see them without uttering a word. Bank statements, signed agreements, and email correspondences were all there, clear and indisputable. The room was silent except for the low murmur of curiosity and disbelief. I watched as his face turned pale, the confident veneer melting away in front of our parents, siblings, and cousins. He had underestimated me, and now he was exposed for everyone to witness. "You see," I said, keeping my voice calm, measured. "Everything is accounted for. Every dollar is traceable, every action documented. The responsibility was mine to oversee, and the mismanagement isn't just careless, it's deliberate." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. The silence that followed was almost deafening, as if the weight of accountability had settled over the room. My brother tried to protest, to explain, but the stammered words were weak, hollow, and unconvincing. He glanced around, seeking allies, but everyone could see the truth. The years of favoritism, the smug arrogance, the underestimation, they all came crashing down in that single, undeniable revelation. I could see the subtle nods of moral alignment from relatives who had quietly observed his manipulations, but had lacked proof until now. I leaned back slightly, keeping my composure as the tension peaked. My heart pounded with satisfaction, not cruelty, but with the clarity of justice being served. This was the moment where karma met opportunity, where patience, strategy, and subtle observation created a completely satisfying reversal. My brother, once confident and untouchable, was now diminished in the eyes of everyone who mattered. The room gradually relaxed, the murmurs of astonishment giving way to quiet acknowledgement. I felt a wave of vindication wash over me, a mix of relief and triumph that came from exposing wrongdoing with elegance and control. He sat there, pale and speechless, and I realized that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Today the lesson was clear. Underestimate me at your own risk, because I had finally claimed what was rightfully mine. The days following the public confrontation were electric with anticipation. My brother had retreated, subdued and cautious, no longer attempting to assert his false confidence. But I knew that words alone weren't enough to secure lasting control. I needed the law, the undeniable authority of formal documentation, to ensure that the 200K and the respect and trust that came with it could never again be threatened. I contacted the family lawyer, carefully outlining every irregularity, every documented misstep, and every prior attempt by my brother to manipulate the funds. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I felt a rare mixture of calm and exhilaration. The professional validation of my claims was like a seal, transforming the chaos of family politics into something concrete and irreversible. I explained the situation, providing a full timeline, all records, and digital proof of my meticulous management. The lawyer nodded as they reviewed the materials, confirming that my control over the funds could be formalized legally, leaving no room for dispute. Every word, every document, every signed agreement reinforced my authority, and for the first time, I felt completely untouchable. Once the legal processes were underway, I allowed subtle hints to slip during family interactions. Mentions of formalized oversight, casual references to official agreements, and legal confirmation. My brother flinched each time, aware that the walls were closing in. The casual offhand remarks weren't threats. They were markers of control, quietly letting everyone know that the balance of power had shifted permanently. His usual posturing and attempts at charm became increasingly futile under the weight of formal authority. At the next family gathering, the transformation was undeniable. I casually referenced the finalized documents while discussing a minor financial detail, the tone of my voice calm but commanding. My brother's jaw tightened visibly, his eyes darting toward our parents for reassurance, only to find them subtly nodding in my direction. Every glance, every gesture, every whisper now reinforced his diminished influence. The audience of relatives, who had long observed the subtle family hierarchies, could see the reversal unfold in real time. Internally, I reflected on the contrast framing that had carried me here. Where my brother had once been dominant, arrogant, and untouchable, he now existed in a state of vulnerability, hesitant and constrained. I, on the other hand, remained composed, empowered, and strategically positioned, my authority validated not only by documents, but by the visible acknowledgement of the family. The emotional payoff for the audience was undeniable. The underdog had risen, meticulous planning and patience had triumphed, and justice had been formalized. The second power reversal was more than just financial. It was symbolic. Every sneer he had ever thrown, every subtle manipulation, every slight he had delivered was now rendered powerless by the legal and emotional structures I had put into place. I had transformed the chaos and betrayal of the past into a carefully orchestrated victory, and the satisfaction was amplified by its inevitability. My brother could protest, argue, or attempt charm, but nothing could undo the authority I now wielded. As I observed him navigating the same rooms, the same conversations, I felt a sense of calm triumph. The tension he had once used to manipulate and intimidate was now entirely in my control. Each step he took was measured against the reality that he no longer held the upper hand. The audience, whether in the family or watching this drama unfold from the outside, experienced a second, more satisfying reversal. One that wasn't impulsive but deliberate, inevitable, and psychologically resonant. By the end of that week, everything had changed. The 200K was formally under my oversight, but more importantly, the narrative of power had shifted irreversibly. I had proven, with strategy, patience, and intelligence, that I was not only capable of reclaiming what was rightfully mine, but also of asserting lasting authority. The second power reversal delivered a heightened sense of justice, leaving both my brother and the audience acutely aware of the consequences of underestimation, manipulation, and arrogance. In the quiet days after the legal formalities were complete, the family atmosphere shifted in ways I had long anticipated, but still found profound. The subtle tension that had pervaded every gathering was replaced with a new equilibrium, one in which my brother's arrogance no longer dictated the room. He existed now in a state of cautious humility, aware that his miscalculations had real consequences. I felt a quiet sense of vindication, the kind that doesn't need applause or acknowledgement, because the truth was evident in every glance, every hushed conversation, and every tentative joke he attempted. I spent time reflecting on the patterns that had defined our family for so long: favoritism, unspoken hierarchies, and manipulations that had shaped my childhood and early adulthood. It was a mix of anger and clarity, but more than anything, it was empowerment. I had faced years of subtle betrayals, ignored contributions, and underestimation, and yet I had used patience, strategy, and observation to reclaim control. The satisfaction wasn't just about the 200K. It was about proving to myself and everyone around me that I was capable of standing firm, of asserting authority, and of navigating the complex web of family politics with intelligence and composure. Flashbacks came unbidden, highlighting contrasts I had lived through. Birthdays overlooked, holidays where my achievements were minimized, moments when my contributions were dismissed in favor of my brother's perceived superiority. Revisiting these memories, I felt a strange mix of bitterness and closure. Each painful memory now served as a reminder of how far I had come, how much resilience I had cultivated, and how carefully I had orchestrated the turn of events. Those past injustices no longer held power over me. They had been transformed into tools for insight, strategy, and ultimately justice. I also reflected on my brother, the antagonist in this story. He had been defeated socially, emotionally, and morally. His confidence, once a shield, had crumbled under scrutiny, and the family now saw him in a new light. I didn't feel cruelty toward him. Rather, there was a calm satisfaction in witnessing the natural consequences of his choices. The moral arc had played out perfectly. Those who relied on arrogance, manipulation, and underestimation were exposed, while integrity, patience, and careful strategy were rewarded. The audience, the family in this case, could see the balance restored. There was a bitter sweetness in the aftermath too. The family unit wasn't perfect, and old wounds remained. Relationships would take time to mend, and the subtle tension would never fully disappear. But there was a profound sense of closure in knowing that fairness had been restored, that boundaries were enforced, and that manipulation could no longer thrive unchecked. I felt stronger, more self-assured, and validated in ways that words alone could not capture. In quiet moments, I revisited my inner monologues, recognizing the lessons embedded in every twist of this journey. Trust must be paired with vigilance. Patience can be a powerful weapon, and understanding the true motives of those around you is essential to navigating complex dynamics. I realized that empowerment isn't just about victory. It's about self-respect, clarity, and moral certainty. As I looked forward, I felt a profound sense of calm. The 200K was secure, but more importantly, the power balance had shifted irrevocably. My brother's role in the family hierarchy had been redefined, and I had emerged not only victorious, but also wiser and more resilient. In the end, justice had been served, not through rage or impulsive confrontation, but through careful strategy, unwavering patience, and the quiet strength of knowing my own worth. The lessons were hard-earned, the victory deeply satisfying, and the moral arc complete. Victory had a strange taste, sweet, undeniably satisfying, yet laced with the faint bitterness of what had been lost along the way. The 200K was finally secure, my brother's manipulations exposed, and the power balance within the family irrevocably shifted. Yet even in the glow of triumph, I couldn't ignore the fractures that had deepened over the years. Family gatherings would never feel entirely the same. There was a lingering awareness of past betrayals, of trust broken, and of relationships altered in ways that couldn't easily be mended. I found myself reflecting on the cost of the journey. The hours spent planning, observing, and gathering evidence had been necessary, but they had also kept me distant, cautious, and sometimes resentful. Every subtle victory carried with it reminders of the emotional scars, birthdays overlooked, favoritism endured, casual dismissals that had accumulated over time. Even as I stood in a place of authority and respect, I recognized that the emotional toll of reclaiming justice had been significant. There was also the matter of my brother. I felt no joy in his humiliation, only a quiet acknowledgement that consequences had been unavoidable. He had been given opportunities to act differently, to show integrity, but he had chosen deception, arrogance, and entitlement instead. Seeing him subdued, careful, and hesitant in family interactions was satisfying in a strategic sense, yet it also reminded me of the complicated nature of family dynamics. People we love and grow up with can wound us deeply, and sometimes justice comes at the cost of relational harmony. Despite the fractures, there was a profound sense of empowerment. I had learned that patience, observation, and thoughtful action could shift power even in the most challenging circumstances. I had transformed betrayal into strategy, turning years of neglect, favoritism, and underestimation into a roadmap for vindication. That realization provided a unique kind of relief, proof that intelligence, patience, and moral clarity could outweigh deceit, arrogance, and privilege. Flashbacks lingered, not as sources of anger, but as markers of growth. I remembered moments of subtle exclusion, whispers behind my back, and the casual superiority my brother wielded as though it were his birthright. Each memory had shaped me, honed my awareness, and prepared me for this reversal. While the journey had been painful, it had also been formative, and the lessons carried weight beyond mere financial control or social dominance. Looking at my family now, I could see subtle shifts. Respect was quietly restored, boundaries were clearer, and the subtle tension that had always defined our relationships had been recalibrated. There was still wariness in their glances, moments of hesitation in conversation, but there was also recognition, an acknowledgement that fairness had been established, and that attempts to manipulate or dominate would no longer be tolerated. I had won not just the battle over funds, but the moral and social authority that had long been denied to me. In the quiet of the evening, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Victory was satisfying, yes, but it was not without cost. Family bonds had been strained, past grievances surfaced, and the landscape of trust had been altered forever. Yet there was emotional relief in knowing that justice had been served, that boundaries had been asserted, and that I had stood firm in the face of deceit. As the night drew to a close, I felt a mixture of triumph and contemplation. The $200K was secure, my brother's power diminished, and the balance of respect restored. But I also understood that family, with all its flaws, would never be untouched by the events that had unfolded. In that recognition lay the true bittersweetness of victory, a reminder that triumph is never simple, that justice often comes with complexity, and that the most meaningful victories are those that leave us stronger, wiser, and acutely aware of the emotional landscapes we navigate.